Markup, either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Please note that once you unmute your microphone, anything that is said in WebEx will be heard over the loudspeakers in the committee room and subject to be heard by the live stream and C-SPAN. Additionally, I ask members participating remotely to use the raised hand feature of the software platform when you wish to be recognized. During voice votes, members participating remotely will need to unmute yourself so that we can hear your response. During recorded votes, you will need to unmute yourself after your name is called to respond to the clerk. In responding to the clerk, I ask that instead of just saying yes or no, that you respond with a phrase like, Mike Doyle from Pennsylvania votes yes. This will provide additional time for the voting member to be identified and made visible on the platform. Since members are participating from different locations at today's markup, all recognition of members will be in the order of subcommittee seniority. During this markup, amendments will be sent to members electronically. Members participating in person should not bring paper copies of their amendments to the clerk's desk. If a member participating in person would like a paper copy of an amendment or bill, please alert staff during the consideration of the amendment or bill. Amendments and motions should be sent to Chloe Rodriguez and Perry Hamilton, and documents for the record to Joe Orlando at the email addresses that we've provided to staff. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Well, good morning, colleagues, and welcome. I'm pleased that we're here today to do the important work of discussing, amending, and moving forward 7 bipartisan bills that will collectively strengthen our government's management of spectrum and make our communications network stronger, help protect people facing emergencies and crises, and promote wireless innovation. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for all of their hard work to reach agreement on the text of these bills. I'd like to begin by discussing my bill with Representative Latta, H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act. Not only does this bill reflect important policy goals, namely returning the Department of Commerce to the driver's seat when it comes to managing federal spectrum, but will also, with the aims Representative Latta will offer today, use proceeds from the auction required in the bill to fund programs that will have immense public benefit. This includes providing the Federal Communications Commission with the funding it needs to rip and replace all of the suspect network equipment made by vendors that pose a national security risk. And it will also provide the public with secure, reliable, advanced 911 communications networks for the times of emergency and disaster. You know, sometimes a telephone call can't fully convey the important information to first responders the way that a picture or video can. Next-gen 911 networks will allow these operation centers to communicate with the public in all of the ways we communicate with one another. That will save lives of our fellow Americans, including police and firefighters. We want to make sure that this program is fully funded so that no community is left behind. And if the funding provided in this bill doesn't do the job, we're going to keep pushing and fighting to make it happen. We also consider H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act of 2022, introduced by Representatives Davids, Joyce, Welsh, and Johnson. This bill would extend the FCC's general auction authority for an additional 18 months, so it doesn't expire in September. Now, I know there's been a lot of public debate around how long this extension should be, and I would have liked to have seen it extended for longer. But this was the product of a bipartisan negotiation and is needed to make sure that the FCC's authority does not expire in the middle of an important auction. As we've heard in our prior hearings this year, it's important to our continued global leadership on spectrum innovation that we provide certainty to the public, and this bill ensures that the FCC doesn't face tough questions about what they are able to do or not in the absence of congressional authority. So I'm glad we're advancing this bipartisan bill to provide that stability and certainty regarding FCC's auctions. We're also marking up two bills that advance our spectrum innovation goals. H.R. 5486, the SMART Act, was introduced by Representative Guthrie. It requires the Assistant Secretary of Communications and Information at NTIA to develop and implement framework to enhance the sharing of spectrum between federal entities and non-federal users, as well as between multiple federal entities. As we know, spectrum resources are only becoming more scarce, and this will help us share our federal airways more efficiently. Also, H.R. 4990, Mr. Carter's ITS Codification Act, provides statutory authority for the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences, a key part of NTIA that plays an important role in studying and testing a range of spectrum issues. Regarding personal safety, I'm pleased we are marking up the Safe Connections Act, introduced in the House by Representatives Custer and Eshoo, and in the Senate by Senator Schatz. H.R. 7132 provides important protections for survivors of horrible crimes like domestic abuse, sexual assault, and trafficking who share a mobile service account with their abusers. This legislation will ensure that these survivors can exit these plans without financial penalty, and also allows them to utilize the Lifeline or Affordable Connectivity Program as a backstop. Finally, we're marking up two bills related to affordability and universal service. H.R. 4275, the Ensuring Phone and Internet Access for SNAP Recipients of Act of 2021, has been introduced by Representatives Loria and Katko, and will help Congress and community partners better understand how to reach households eligible for Lifeline and ACP, since we know these programs are under-enrolled and could be helping more people. Finally, Representatives Hayes and Vesey's H.R. 5400, the Preventing Disruptions to Universal Service Funds Act, would exempt the Universal Service Fund programs from Anti-Deficiency Act provisions to ensure that programs provide essential connectivity like E-rate and Lifeline that they can continue without disruption. So, as you can see, we have some very important bills before us today, and I look forward to discussing and then advancing them all to the full committee. And with that, I will yield back my time, and it gives me great pleasure to recognize Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman and appreciate you holding this markup today and all the work from our members. Mr. Chairman, today's markup, we're going to be working to ensure that there are bills on today's markup have received bipartisan support, and we've been able to do that. The bills we are considering today range from extending the FCC spectrum auction authority for 18 months, to investing in infrastructure, to improving efficiency and management of our nation's airways, all without frivolous spending. This is what we accomplish when we work together and legislation goes through the committee process. I want to thank my colleagues, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, and the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for leading the charge to improve the management of our nation's spectrum resources. Mr. Carter's legislation, the ITS Codification Act, would strengthen the role of NTIA's Institute of Telecommunications Sciences. This premier laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, will continue to play an important role in transforming our wireless future as new innovations continue to demand more access to spectrum resources. Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act would also take an important step forward in bolstering NTIA's management of federal agency spectrum usage. This legislation builds on committee action to provide NTIA with additional tools to make more spectrum available for commercial purposes and to coordinate the spectrum needs of federal agencies across the government. I'd also like to thank Chairman Doyle for working with me to make improvements to our Spectrum Innovation Act, as well to uphold our commitment to providing resources for small carriers to remove Huawei and other untrusted equipment from our communication networks. Finally, I would like to thank Chairman Pallone and our ranking Republican, Rodgers, and the rest of my colleagues for working with us on other pieces of legislation we're considering today. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4275, the Ensuring Phone and Internet Access Through Lifeline and Affordable Connectivity Program Act, makes significant changes to provide Congress with information on the enrollment of these programs, which will help inform our ongoing review of the universal service programs. I look forward to continuing to work together to finalize this legislation for full committee markup. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Today, the Communications and Technology Subcommittee will mark up 7 bipartisan bills that will collectively strengthen our communications networks, make phone and internet service more affordable, and help protect Americans. First, we'll consider a bill that helps address the barriers faced by households that can't afford phone and internet service. The FCC administers 2 important programs that address affordability, the Affordable Connectivity Program and the Lifeline Program. And right now, we know that both programs are under-enrolled and not helping everyone who could benefit from them. So H.R. 4275, which was introduced by Representatives Luria and Katko, requires the FCC to annually submit a report to Congress on the enrollment of individuals in these 2 programs who also participate in programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Medicaid, and federal Pell Grants. It would also require the GAO to identify the outreach and publicity efforts for programs to make sure that qualified households know and can sign up for them. And this bill should help us reach more of the people who could benefit from these programs. We'll also consider 2 bills directed at the work of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Taken together, H.R. 4990 and H.R. 5486 provide NTIA with the resources to develop innovative spectrum management technologies, led in part by NTIA's Institute for Telecommunications Services, and I thank Representatives O'Halloran, Carter, Matsui, and Guthrie for their bipartisan work on these bills. In addition, H.R. 5400, the Preventing Disruptions to Universal Service Funds Act, introduced by Representative Hayes and Veazey. This bill extends the Anti-Deficiency Act exemption on the FCC's universal service programs, and without this extension, programs like rural broadband, rural health care, telemedicine, E-rate, and Lifeline could be at risk. Our 5th bill is H.R. 7132, the Safe Connections Act, introduced by Representatives Custer and Eshoo, and this would help protect survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and other related crimes. It does this by requiring mobile providers to separate the survivor's phone line from an account shared with their abusers without financial penalties or other potential challenges upon request from a survivor. The FCC is also required to establish emergency communication support for these survivors, and I'm pleased we're moving this forward on a bipartisan basis. We have 2 important bills related to how the government manages our airways, H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act, which was introduced by Representatives Davis, Joyce, Welch, and Johnson. This would extend the FCC's auction authority by 18 months from its expiration date later this fall. And the goal is to ensure the FCC will be able to hold its planned spectrum auction in July without disruption and to successfully close out these auctions that have already occurred. Congress has never let the FCC spectrum authority lapse, and today's action puts us one step closer to extending it once again. And finally, we have H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act, introduced by Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta. Mr. Chairman Doyle already explained this, but it helps streamline the process for making airwaves in the lower 3 gigahertz band available for commercial use. It also establishes a process for the Secretary of Commerce to identify, with assistance from the Department of Defense and the FCC, at least 200 megahertz in the lower 3 gigahertz band for exclusive or shared use. And the legislation requires an auction of these airways within 7 years. So I just think it's imperative that the federal government continue to follow the tried and true statutory framework of Congress that has provided, that makes our airways available for commercial wireless use, which is why the Spectrum Innovation Act is so necessary. And I'm pleased that we've reached agreement to fund important public programs with the proceeds from the auction required in the Spectrum Innovation Act. So Next Generation 911 will save lives by giving first responders the information they need to respond to dangerous situations. And we do have to fund this program so that all communities have access to those advanced networks. And we will also fully fund the FCC's RIP and Replace program to ensure that our communications networks are not vulnerable. And again, thanks to Ranking Member Rodgers, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, as well as Representatives Eshoo, Matsui, Hudson, and Guthrie for their efforts in getting this bill ready for markup. And it's always, I always need to stress that it's great that we're able to reach bipartisan agreement on these bills. We've been doing so much lately on a bipartisan basis, which I think is crucial if we're ever going to get these bills signed into law. So thank you again, Chairman Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. It gives me now great pleasure to recognize Mrs. Rodgers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning and welcome to today's markup. Today we're considering 7 bills that have bipartisan support. While we still have more work to do before this legislation is considered by the full committee, I want to thank my colleagues on this subcommittee for working diligently with us over the past several months to prepare for today. This committee has a rich history of bipartisanship on some of the most pressing issues before us as a nation, especially in the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Today, we are reviewing many communication solutions that range from providing new tools to improve spectrum management to making it easier for victims of domestic violence to separate from a cellular service contract that is shared with their abuser. We're providing funds to small communication carriers to secure their networks. We must provide American data and information, and that starts by making sure our networks are secure. We are doing all of this without spending a dime of taxpayer money. We're responsible in our targeting of resources by using the proceeds from the spectrum auction to pay for these programs. Finally, we are considering legislation to extend the FCC's spectrum auction authority by 18 months so they can continue their work to make spectrum resources available without interruption. As the demand for technology grows, additional spectrum resources are necessary to promote innovation so people can access technologies that improve their lives, like faster internet, better cell service, and smart devices. I encourage my colleagues to continue their work and include this legislation along with Mr. Guthrie's SMART Act with the Spectrum Innovation Act at full committee. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to our continued work to resolve many differences before the full committee markup so that we can build support on these solutions, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mrs. Rodgers. Are there any other members that seek recognition to make an opening statement? I see on our side first, Ms. Eshoo. Then we'll get the, yeah. So Anna, you are recognized for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm pleased that today's markup includes legislation that I co-authored with Congresswoman Custer, the Safe Connections Act. That is going to ensure that survivors of domestic violence can access the important tools that they need. I'm also pleased that our markup finally makes progress on much needed legislation to bring our country's 911 services into the 21st century. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to 7624 includes an updated version of legislation I introduced last Congress to establish a new federal grant program to help fund the nationwide adoption of next generation 911. This will make our emergency communications centers more secure, and we all have them in every single one of our districts. It's going to make these centers more secure, resilient, interoperable, and reliable. In short, it's going to help save lives. So I look forward to seeing these bills become law. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Johnson for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am really proud to co-lead H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act, and I'm pleased it's part of today's markup. This bill would prevent the FCC's auction authority from expiring in September by extending it for another 18 months. It's critical that Congress act to ensure the Commission maintains its authority to auction spectrum bandwidth. As we've seen, spectrum auctions are an important revenue generator and have been used to fund other telecommunications priorities. I was very supportive of the decision to hold a public auction of C-band spectrum, which brought in $100 billion just last year. It is also crucial that the United States maintain its leadership in 5G deployment, and spectrum is a key component of that. America must win the race to 5G and unlock the social and economic benefits that stem from 5G technology. As a co-chair of the 5G caucus, I know how vitally important it is that the FCC maintains its ability to auction badly needed spectrum at such a pivotal time. I thanks for the time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, or is there any other member that seeks recognition to make an opening statement? Well, seeing none, I think we'll move on to the first bill. At this time, we'll begin bill consideration. The chair calls up H.R. 4275, the Ensuring Phone and Internet Access for SNAP Recipients Act of 2021. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4275, a bill to provide for certain reports on enrollment in the Lifeline program and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and is open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 4275? Seeing none, are there any members that wish to offer an amendment? Is Mr. Vesey present? I understand he is looking to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Mr. Vesey?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4275, offered by Mr. Pallone of New Jersey. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert
Without
the following.
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Pallone is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was an amendment. It was originally going to be proposed by Mr. Vesey, and it's just technical. It changes the title of the bill and ensures that the report includes enrollment in the Affordable Connectivity Program and captures all of the automatic qualifying programs. The AINS will require the GAO to conduct the report on outreach and publicity efforts instead of the FCC.
Okay, are there any members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4275 will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4275 is agreed to. Well, we'll move to a recorded vote. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 4275 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4275 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and H.R. 4275 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Okay. Chair now calls up H.R. 4990, the Institute of Telecommunications Sciences Codification Act, or the ITS Codification Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4990, a bill to codify the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences and to direct the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications
Without
and Information.
objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill was considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 4990?
Mr. Chairman O'Halloran.
Chair recognizes Mr. O'Halloran.
Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Labeled
Okay,
O'Halloran underscore 224.
Thank you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4990, offered by Mr. O'Halloran of Arizona.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. O'Halloran, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is bipartisan, offered with my colleague, Mr. Carter, and seeks to make some clarifications to the functions of the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, ITS, and the scope of its ability to enter into agreements and transactions. This legislation is an important step to ensure that the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, through its test centers, continues its responsibility to promote the effective use of spectrum by federal users. ITS plays an important role at NTIA. Its work often lays the foundation for NTIA's spectrum management and policy decisions. ITS also helps drive innovation forward by exploring cutting-edge technology, including by engaging with academia and industry. Under this legislation, ITS must also establish an initiative to support the development of emergency communication and tracking technologies for use in locating individuals that may be trapped in enclosed spaces, which could not be timelier for my constituents. In my district, we are currently battling 2 wildfires near Flagstaff, and while our firefighters and our first responders are doing a tremendous job to contain these fires and evacuate residents, federal efforts to improve communications in emergency situations like these are truly life-saving developments. The AIMS makes simple changes to Mr. Carter's bill by clarifying the role ITS plays in developing advances in spectrum management and the appropriate instances when ITS is permitted to enter into agreements and transactions. I want to thank Congressman Carter for working with me on this amendment, and I'm proud to join him in this effort. This bill is beneficial not only for our country, but also will help the United States remain a leader in furthering innovative spectrum management policies. For all these reasons, this is an important amendment and a worthwhile bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you and Ranking Member Latta for calling up my legislation, H.R. 4990, the ITS Codification Act. I also would like to thank Representative O'Halloran for offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute, which makes only minor technical corrections to underlying legislation. This bill, which has bipartisan support, will work to provide the needed statutory authority for the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences. As we know, ITS is the research and engineering laboratory that supports the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's mission to manage radio frequency spectrum. With the enactment of this legislation, ITS will also be required to further develop emergency communication and tracking technologies in our country. Through this action, NTIA will make progress in locating and rescuing individuals who are trapped in confined spaces who are not otherwise able to carry out conventional radio communication. As a healthcare professional, I know how every moment counts when it comes to getting a person out of these situations and returning them to their family. Therefore, the ITS Codification Act is a bill to help the American people. By codifying the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences, we will open the door for advancement in the wireless technology. I would ask all my colleagues to fully support this legislation, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we will go to a recorded vote on the Ames. I understand you want a recorded vote. Those in favor of... Just on final? Oh, okay. If there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4990 will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4990 is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 4990 as amended to the full committee. My understanding that we've been asked for a recorded vote, so a recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4990 as amended to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. Aye. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Vesey.
Aye.
Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mr. Soto. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran votes aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo of California votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui of California votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas from California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Craig. Ms. Fletcher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Scalise.
Mr. Scalise votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bilirakis.
Aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg.
Aye.
Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers. Chairman Doyle. Chairman Doyle votes aye.
Madam Clerk, Mr. Soto, how am I recorded?
Mr. Soto is not recorded.
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye.
Madam Clerk, this is Ms. Fletcher. How am I recorded?
Ms. Fletcher is not recorded.
How is Mrs. Rodgers
Fletcher votes
recorded?
aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers is not recorded. Mrs. Rodgers votes aye.
Is there anyone else who wishes to be recorded? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
1 second. Yes, who's seeking recognition?
This
Mr.
is,
McEachin?
Mr. McEachin, I apologize.
How is he
How am I
recorded?
recorded,
Mr.
sir?
McEachin is not recorded.
I wish to be recorded as aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye.
Okay, if no one else wishes to vote, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 27 and the nays were 0.
Yeas 27, the nays 0. H.R. 4990, as amended, is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, next the chair calls up H.R. 5400, the Preventing Disruptions to Universal Service Funds Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5400, a bill to amend the Universal Service Anti-Deficiency Temporary Suspension Act to further exempt the Universal Service Fund from certain Title 31 provisions. Section 1, short title.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 5400?
Me, Mr. Chairman.
Who's that? The chair recognizes Mr. Vesey. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to give remarks and offer up remarks on HR 5400.
Gentleman wishes to strike the last word and speak on the bill. Gentleman is
Yes, sir.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was proud to introduce HR 5400, the Preventing Disruptions to Universal Services Funds Act, last year, along with my good friend and colleague, Congresswoman Hayes of Connecticut. The legislation would ensure that federal funds for universal service fund programs are not at risk for disruption by the application of Anti-Deficiency Act. We all know how critical access to the internet was during the pandemic, and we will continue to be, to think about that issue as we tackle the digital divide and the homework gap in our country. Many of the constituents in the district that I represent really did rely on critical USF programs funded by the Universal Service Fund, a service that low-income Americans and students depend on for access to consistent telephone and internet connection to help them live their daily lives. This legislation ensures that this vital program will not be disrupted. And with everything else going on in our country, our schools and kids don't need any more roadblocks that will keep them from living and thriving in our schools and communities. I'm glad that we were able to reach bipartisan consensus on this bill as it moves forward, although I would have liked to have seen an exemption for a longer period of time. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will work with me on this in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and urge the passage of this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 5400? Mr. Curtis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has a amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5400
Without
offered by...
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Curtis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment today simply exempts the Universal Service Fund from the Anti-Deficiency Act through December 2023, which allows the FCC and USCC to continue administrating these programs while retaining congressional oversight. I appreciate my colleagues' bipartisan support of this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote yea. I yield my time.
Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion or amendments, we can proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5400 will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5400 is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 5400 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5400 will signify by saying aye. Gentlemen, would like a roll call vote? Okay, recorded vote is requested and ordered. Those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5400 as amended to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Vesey.
Aye.
Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mr. Soto.
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran, Arizona, aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo of California votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui of California votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas, California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Craig. Ms. Fletcher.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Scalise.
Scalise votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bilirakis.
Bilirakis votes aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers. Mrs. Rodgers votes aye. Chairman Doyle.
Yes.
Chairman Doyle votes aye.
How is Mr. Guthrie recorded?
Mr. Guthrie is not recorded. Mr. Guthrie votes aye.
Is there anyone else that needs to be recorded?
This is Miss Craig. How am I recorded?
Ms. Craig is not recorded.
Miss Craig votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Mr. Hudson, how am I recorded?
How am I recorded?
Mr. Hudson is recorded as
Welch, how am I
aye.
recorded?
Who is that just? Mr. Welch,
Mr.
how is Mr. Welch recorded?
Mr. Welch is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye.
How is Mr. McEachin recorded?
Mr. McEachin is not recorded.
Well, we see him on the screen. Mr. McEachin, do you wish to vote? Might want to check his audio. I see his lips moving, but there's nothing coming through.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How's Mr. Bilirakis recorded?
Mr. Bilirakis is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone else that wishes to be recorded? Okay. How is Mr. Johnson recorded?
Mr. Johnson is not recorded. Mr. Johnson votes aye.
How is, Mr. McEachin, can you check your mute button must be on? I can see you're trying to vote, but your voice isn't coming through.
Mr. Chairman, how is O'Halloran recorded?
Mr. O'Halloran is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Mr. McEachin? I don't, you know what, it looks like he's having connection problems. Okay. Is there anyone else that wishes to be recorded? Does anyone wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 29 and the nays were 0.
The ayes were 29, the nays were 0. The amendment, H.R. 5400 as amended, has passed and is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, moving right along. The chair calls up H.R. 5486, the Simplifying Management, Reallocation, and Transfer of Spectrum Act or the SMART Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5486, a bill to amend the National Telecommunications and Information
Without
Administration.
objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 5486? Is there any?
Mr. Chairman,
Who is that? For what purpose does Ms. Matsui seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Ms. Matsui, is it an amendment in nature of a substitute?
Yes, it is.
The clerk will report that amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5486, offered by Ms. Matsui of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Ms. Matsui, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank my friend, Congressman Guthrie, for being such a great partner on this amendment and the bill generally. The demand for spectrum is increasing, and it is innovative approaches like the one outlined in the SMART Act that will help ensure America remains a global pace setter in wireless communications technology. As the statutory manager of the federal government's use of spectrum, NTIA supports America's domestic and international spectrum goals while making efficient use of a limited resource. The SMART Act will establish a common platform for sharing spectrum across the government and with commercial users. This platform will provide NTIA another tool to manage the federal spectrum footprint while creating new opportunities to make spectrum available for commercial use. By coordinating between federal agencies and with private partners, the government can be more efficient with the spectrum it has and provide the framework we need to give more commercial users valuable access to this limited resource. My amendment will help ensure that the coordination being done supports a broad range of users and industries to give everyone a seat at the table and keep innovation strong. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing no one else, if there's no further discussion, Mr. Latta, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To enter a colloquy with the chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask for your commitment that as we move forward to the full committee, that we work together on offsetting the costs associated with implementing the Smart Spectrum Act by using auction proceeds from the Spectrum Innovation Act. Today's markup in the bipartisan substitute amendment shows how we can address these priorities while being responsible stewards of American taxpayer dollars. Relative to the billions in proceeds that will secure our networks and facilitate a transition to NG 911, the Smart Spectrum Act's modest price tag will pay for itself over years of improved spectrum management. And at this time, I'll yield to the chairman.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to thank him and Mr. Guthrie for the work on the Smart Spectrum Act and for working with Vice Chair Matsui on a bipartisan substitute amendment to accommodate our feedback. This legislation is an important step forward in advancing innovative spectrum management tools that will allow the federal entities to share our airways more efficiently. Indeed, this legislation will not only improve sharing opportunities between non-federal users and federal incumbent entities, but also bolsters NTIA's mission as our nation's federal spectrum manager. Given the bill's importance and its bipartisan nature, I commit to working with you before the full committee markup.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5486 will signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5486 is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 5486 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5486 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 5486 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 7132, the Safe Connections Act of 2022. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 7132, a bill to preserve safe access to communication services for survivors of domestic violence and other crimes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 7132? Mr. Walberg, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment in nature of a substitute at the desk.
Gentleman has a amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7132, offered by Mr.
Without
Walberg.
objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. And Mr. Walberg, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Safe Connections Act is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that will improve outcomes and safety for survivors of domestic violence. I join my colleagues, Representatives Eshoo and Custer, on this legislation because, as I've said before, no one should ever have to make the choice between staying connected and staying safe. This bipartisan bill allows survivors of domestic violence, stalking, and abuse to separate their cell phone line from any family plan shared with their abuser without having to worry about any immediate financial penalties or other arduous requirements. Shared plans can be used by abusers to continue stalking or controlling their victims, and fees and paperwork should not be another impediment to survivors getting to safety. The bill also identifies that every survivor's situation is different and builds in the flexibility for how each individual can choose to go through the separation process. Furthermore, it directs the FCC to examine additional ways to support and protect survivors after they disconnect. The bill is the product of many, many months of negotiations between the wireless carriers and survivors groups, and I would be remiss if I did not thank our colleagues in the Senate, Senators Fisher and Schatz, for their hard work on this legislation. The compromise strikes the right balance between ensuring easier separation processes for survivors while not causing undue burden for some of our smallest wireless providers across the country. The AINS makes needed technical corrections that help clarify the legislation's intent. In today's interconnected world, your cell phone is your lifeline. For survivors, that's even more true. It's how they stay connected with friends and family, how they can seek resources, and how they can begin building a new life away from their abusers. I encourage all my colleagues to support the amendment in the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Chair recognizes, for what purpose does Ms. Eshoo seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to join Representative Walberg in offering this AINS for the Safe Connections Act. As was stated, abusers are increasingly using everyday digital tools to coerce and control their victims, and that's what this legislation is about. Shared phone plans pose a unique danger for survivors of domestic violence because they ensure that abusers have the tools to monitor their victims' phone calls, their texts, their voicemails, and even their precise physical locations. And then added to this, phone providers make it very difficult and expensive to end a cell phone contract early, charging up to $350 to leave the plan and additional upfront fees. So this poses really an insurmountable barrier to leaving an abusive relationship because studies show that 99% of all domestic violence cases involve financial abuse. That's why I'm proud to co-lead this legislation, the Safe Connections Act, with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to help survivors of domestic violence to regain their digital independence. The bill requires phone companies to waive penalties and other requirements for survivors and their dependents requesting to separate their phone from a shared plan, provided that survivors submit verified evidence of the abuse. Secondly, it requires the FCC to issue rules to ensure survivors can access FCC's Lifeline program or the Affordable Connectivity Program and remain connected after they separate from a shared plan. Thirdly, it directs the FCC to ensure that calls or text to domestic violence hotlines do not appear on call logs. I'm pleased that the Senate passed this legislation unanimously. So now it's our turn to step up and pass this needed bill through our subcommittee. This amendment makes several technical minor edits to the bill to ensure the language is as effective as possible, and it aligns with the Senate passed version. And so I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Thank for her sponsorship on this legislation, and certainly Congressman Wahlberg, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta for working with us on this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Chair recognizes Mr. Soto. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a lawyer and as a member of Congress, I've seen this happen far too often, and it can be discouraging and dangerous to victims of domestic violence. Imagine being in a courtroom trying to prosecute on behalf of a victim a domestic violence injunction, and the last thing people are thinking about is that they can't decouple their cell phone from their batterer, from the violent spouse or significant other. And judges would just shrug their shoulders, throw up their hands, and say they lacked authority to really do anything. Meanwhile, a domestic abuser would then be able to harass, track, or possibly even injure or kill a domestic violence victim by being able to use the very cell phones and the bills that they share together. In Congress, I've continued to hear this among constituents far too often. So today we say enough is enough. This bill will make sure we have easy ways for victims of domestic violence to get separate lines, to waive fees so they don't have financial burdens while doing this, and empower victims to move on with their lives safely. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? If there is no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7132 will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7132 is agreed to. Now, it's my understanding that we are being requested a recorded vote. So a recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of forwarding H.R. 7132 as amended to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Vesey.
Aye.
Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
Aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran of Arizona votes aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo of California votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui of California votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Welch.
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas, California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Craig.
Craig votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Ms. Fletcher.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bilirakis.
Aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers. Chairman Doyle.
Yes.
Chairman Doyle votes aye.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded? Okay. How about on the Democratic side? Anyone wish to be recorded that isn't? How is Mr. Johnson recorded?
Mr. Johnson is recorded as aye.
Here we go. How is Mrs. Rodgers recorded?
Mrs. Rodgers is not recorded. Mrs. Rodgers votes aye.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? Okay, if not, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 29 and the nays were 0.
29-0. The bill as amended, HR, pardon me? How is Mr. Scalise recorded?
Mr. Scalise is not recorded.
Mr. Scalise, do you wish to be recorded? We can see your pretty face, but we can't hear you. Just kidding about your face. Well, we can't hear Mr. Scalise either, so I guess we will just move forward with the vote. So the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 29 and the nays were 0.
Okay, so HR 7132 as amended is forwarded to the full committee, passing unanimously. The chair now calls up HR 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act of 2022. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 7624, a bill to make available additional frequencies in the 3.1.
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak? Mr. Latta, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7624, offered by Mr.
Without objection,
Latta.
the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Latta, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My bipartisan aims to the Spectrum Innovation Act will provide clarity to the auction of the lower 3 gigahertz band, which was mandated in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We must provide certainty to the federal spectrum relocation process led by NTIA to ensure this auction is a success. As we have seen with past auctions, this certainty encourages bidders to participate robustly in auctions, providing immense economic benefit to Americans. This amendment also directs proceeds from the spectrum auction to fully fund the FCC's Secure Networks Reimbursement Program. Congress directed the communications providers to remove Huawei, ZTE, and other untrusted equipment from their networks, and established a reimbursement program at the FCC to help small providers achieve this task. Broadband providers across Ohio and the rest of the nation have taken steps to implement this law at the direction of Congress. Unfortunately, the cost estimate for these reimbursements was based on faulty analysis that resulted in a $3.4 billion shortfall. My amendment will use the proceeds from this spectrum auction to fully fund the FCC's reimbursement program to allow carriers to complete their important work to enhance our national security. My amendment also includes legislation from my colleagues and Next Generation 911 co-chairs, Mr. Hudson and Ms. Eshu, to facilitate a nationwide transition to Next Gen 911. This legislation provides direction to NTIA to stand up a successful grant program to ensuring our 911 network can meet the demands of the 21st century. Funding for both of these programs to promote public safety and national security will be funded using spectrum auction proceeds rather than taxpayer dollars. This is an efficient use of funds that does not contribute to our nation's massive debt. I'd like to thank our colleagues across the aisle for continuing to work with us on this legislation. I am hopeful that we can include the extension of the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority and Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act as part of this broader package as we move to full committee. I urge my colleagues to support this AINS, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Oh, I yield to my friend.
Well, thank you very much. Rather than taking time, I just want to also say that I want to thank my Republican colleagues for working with us to fund these important objectives, and I want to urge everyone on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment. And with that, I yield back to my good friend.
And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields
I'm
back.
sorry, Mr.
Well,
Chairman, I
I'll
yield
wait.
to the
I'll wait.
gentlelady.
Oh, wait. Oh, I can probably do it in 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, just want to join. I appreciate your work with us to improve these bills. H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act. Mr. Latta's amendment addresses two critical national security and public safety priorities that this committee has had a proud history of leading. First, the amendment addresses the shortfall in funding the Rip and Replace reimbursement program to remove Huawei and other untrusted communications equipment from our communications networks. As this committee continues to lead on solutions to secure wireless leadership and address cybersecurity risk, ensuring small providers can remove this equipment is essential. Additionally, I'd like to thank Mr. Latta for working with Mr. Hudson and Ms. Eshu on incorporating bipartisan landmark Next Generation 911 legislation into the amendment. The amendment allows up to $10 billion of spectrum auction proceeds to go toward upgrading our nation's 911 infrastructure, providing pure benefit to taxpayers. Congress, the public safety community, and the technical experts have worked for a decade to understand the cost and the roadmap for transitioning nationwide NG 911. And I'm pleased that this agreement is moving forward. As we move to enact this package into law, I'd like to see the 18-month extension of the FCC's General Auction Authority included at the full committee level. This committee has a rich history of working together bipartisan to advance legislation that becomes law, and incorporating this provision will be critical to ensuring its successful passage. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to be working together to move this forward, and I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Latta's amendment.
Would the ranking member yield to me?
Yes, okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you and also Ranking Member Latta and obviously Chairman Doyle and Ms. Eshu for her part with the funding. It's really great to see that we're funding both the replacement of suspect telecommunications equipment in our networks as well as NG 911. And this $10 billion and all this is a great step forward to make sure that this technology is available to all communities. So I want to thank everybody again and yield back.
And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? See down there,
Mr. Hudson.
Mr. Hudson. I was going to call you Mr. Duncan. Sorry about that, Mr. Hudson. You're much better looking than Mr. Duncan.
You're going to make two of them, man. I accept that compliment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. At the beginning of this Congress, I was honored to take over as co-chairman of the Next Generation 911 Caucus, along with my good friend, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. I'm proud of our work together on behalf of our amazing first responders and telecommunicators who work 24/7 to protect our communities. This caucus has worked in a bipartisan way for years to craft the Next Generation 911 legislation in a way that promotes interoperable 911 networks and updates the infrastructure that we rely on to protect public safety and save lives. 911 saves lives, protects property, and provides a critical service to public safety. Throughout every part of the country, the response to most emergencies begins with a citizen dialing 911. The dedicated 911 professionals who receive these calls provide life-saving instruction and support both to the callers and to responding law enforcement, fire and rescue, and emergency medical services officials. People from every state know they can rely on 911 regardless of where they may be. 911 is a national priority, but much of our country is still using 50-year-old technology. This is a critical national infrastructure that requires updating. Modernizing today's systems to Next Generation 911 requires strong congressional leadership to address pressing issues, including funding, technology, and education. As we aim to ensure a coordinated transition to broadband-enabled, IP-based Next Generation 911, the Congressional Next Generation 911 Caucus will continue to bring attention to 911 and recognize it as an integral part of our country's homeland security. After over a year of working with Chairwoman Eshoo on Next Generation 911 legislation, I am proud we have come to an agreement and see our language included in this markup. And indeed, I look forward to continuing to work together and getting this life-saving bill signed into law. And with that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hudson, would you yield to me?
I would be happy to yield to the chairman.
I just wanted to say, obviously, this $10 billion is a great step forward. And I want to thank you and Ms. Eshoo, but I do want to say that I'm going to continue to push for additional funding for this technology to save lives at every opportunity. And I also wanted to thank Chairwoman Rosenworcel of the FCC for her leadership on this issue, because she's really done a lot to pave the way to getting this accomplished today. So thanks again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your help in moving this forward. And indeed, $10 billion is a whole lot more than zero, and I certainly appreciate those who will continue to push. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? For what purpose does Ms. Eshoo seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. No mystery that I strongly support this amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Latta. 911 is a lifeline for Americans in their greatest hour of need. Many of us as parents taught our children at a very, very young age how to dial 911 and what it means. And it can often be the difference between life and death. This amendment establishes a new federal grant program with up to $10 billion, with a B, in proceeds from the mid-band spectrum auction to fund the nationwide adoption of Next Generation 911. This technology is going to allow all of our 911 emergency communication centers to receive real-time location information. And that means text messages, photos, and videos from individuals at the scene of an emergency, and to share that information with first responders. So here are a couple of examples. It means if someone breaks into your home and you're hiding from the intruder, you don't need to call 911 to speak to an operator. You can text 911 to get help while you continue to hide. It means sending pictures or live streaming video from the scene of a car accident or a home fire to help first responders better respond to the emergency. It means harnessing the power of 21st century technology to respond to 21st century emergencies. And it's going to make our emergency communication centers more secure, more resilient, interoperable, and reliable. Now, going back some years, I co-founded the E911 caucus with then Congressman John Shimkus, and over in the Senate, two names of the past, Senators Hillary Clinton and Conrad Burns in 2003. This was on the heels of the attack on our country, and it was meant to support first responders and the public safety community by modernizing our emergency networks and supporting the one recommendation that had not been fulfilled by Congress, and that was interoperability. We recall with horror that when fire and police went into the Twin Towers, they could not communicate with each other. But 18 years after founding that E911 caucus, we have fallen short of that goal. Most 911 call centers are still using the same legacy technology that was in place when the first 911 call was made over 50 years ago. We're the most innovative country in the world, and we're capable of so much more. And what we're doing today speeds up by decades to where we need to be. This amendment is a new version of the legislation I introduced in the last Congress, and it's been fine-tuned over the last 2 years to reach a compromise with Republicans and stakeholders in the first responder community. I agree with the chairman of the full committee. $10 billion is significant, but it's approximated that $15 billion will be needed to bring all of our call centers to where they need to be. And I think this major step forward will bring us closer to taking the final step so that it is fully funded. I want to thank enormously Congressman Hudson, who's the co-chair of the NG 911 caucus, and his staff for working with me on this legislation. Obviously, I urge all members to support it. This is going to make an enormous difference in each one of our districts for our collective constituents. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
General Lady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Okay. Seeing none, we're going to move to, if there's no further discussion on or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7624 will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7624 is agreed to. We will now move to a recorded vote. A recorded vote being ordered on 7624. Those in favor of forwarding H.R. 7624 as amended to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Vesey.
Aye.
Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo of California votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui of California votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Welch.
Votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas from California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Miss Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Miss Kelly votes aye. Miss Craig. Miss Fletcher.
Fletcher votes aye.
Miss Fletcher votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Scalise.
Scalise votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bilirakis.
Bilirakis votes aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers. Mrs. Rodgers votes aye. Chairman Doyle.
Yes.
Chairman Doyle votes aye.
Recorded.
Mr. Guthrie is not recorded. I vote aye. Mr. Guthrie votes aye.
Is there anyone else seeking to vote?
Mr. Chairman, this is Ms. Craig. How am I recorded?
Ms. Craig is not recorded.
Ms. Craig of Minnesota votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Anyone else wish to be recorded? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? Okay, if not, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 29 and the nays were 0.
The ayes were 29, the noes were 0. H.R. 7624, as amended, is forwarded to the full committee. And now, last but not least, Chair calls up H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act of 2022. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7783, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934
Without
to
objection,
extend...
the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 7783? Is there no hands?
Mr. Chairman,
Okay. Who's seeking recognition?
Ms. Matsui,
Okay, Ms. Matsui, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I chaired the legislative hearing for this bill 2 weeks ago and was really pleased with the bipartisan agreement that we cannot let the FCC's auction authority lapse under any circumstances. Congress has always worked together to extend the FCC spectrum auction authority, and I know we have the political will to keep that record unbroken. This isn't an abstract issue. In July, the FCC will be kicking off the 2.5 gigahertz auction, bringing more needed mid-band spectrum to the market. Even a brief lapse in FCC auction authority could jeopardize licenses from being awarded and delay the impact of this 5G-ready spectrum. A lapse in authority would also threaten the FCC's ability to raise needed revenue. To date, the Commission has held 98 auctions, raised more than $233 billion in revenues, and provided more than $1 trillion in benefits for the American people. To threaten that record with inaction is simply unacceptable. That's why I'm so glad to see our committee moving this bill and look forward to full committee consideration soon. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any other member seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 7783? Anyone on the Republican side? No? Anybody else on our side? Okay. Well, we're going to move to To final passage, I see that a recorded vote is being requested, so a recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of forwarding H.R. 7783 to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Vesey.
VC votes aye.
Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo of California votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui of California votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Welch.
Votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas from California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Craig.
Craig votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Ms. Fletcher.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Scalise.
Scalise votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Guthrie.
Guthrie votes aye.
Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Bilirakis.
Bilirakis votes aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mrs. Rodgers. Mrs. Rodgers votes aye. Chairman Doyle.
Yes.
Chairman Doyle votes aye.
Anyone who wishes to be recorded? Don't see anyone on either side requesting, so we will have the clerk report to tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 29 and the nays were 0.
Yeas 29, nays 0. H.R. 7783 is forwarded to the full committee. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills consistent with the actions taken by the subcommittee today. And with that, this subcommittee now stands adjourned.